Hello, and welcome to the 18th episode of the Chaplain's Assistance Motorpod. I am your host, Gary, and this is the podcast where every other week I discuss my world of G.I. Joe, what I'm going through, current events and news that interest me, and also what I'm just going through personally as I sort through my basement, my mess, my pit. And this week, we've got new news regarding comics, new action figure releases that just dropped in the last couple of days as I'm recording this. And we'll close out taking a look at a vehicle that I managed to put back together again completely for the first time at the end. To start off with current events is that IDW is losing the license for the G.I. Joe and Transformers comic books. Now, this news was broken to The Hollywood Reporter as an exclusive, and reading through the original report by The Hollywood Reporter, they do mention that IDW is retaining the My Little Pony and Dungeons & Dragons licenses. They also mentioned that G.I. Joe and the Transformers licenses are expiring at the end of the year and IDW is not renewing them. There's a couple ways to think of this. Is IDW not renewing them? Because that's the statement from IDW. Or is IDW not being offered the opportunity to renew them? There's something to be said for announcing that, but there's also something to be said for the information that they're withholding. So that is a topic of debate. At the end of the day, a change like this comes down to one thing and one thing only. Cobra Commander's favorite, money. So a decision like this is made with finances in mind. You think about that. They are retaining two of Hasbro's licenses while two Hasbro licenses are going away. Another thing that's not mentioned by any parties so far are the other Hasbro licenses that also had comic books. So I'm talking about ROM, Micronauts, and Mask. Also tertiary visionaries as well. You actually have another 4 properties whose licensing is in limbo. And I mentioned these 4 because they were part of that shared universe that Hasbro and IDW tried to work together with in about 2017, 2018 on. And it really didn't gel well. We were supposed to get movies and we got the comic books, but movies and other media for the toys. And it didn't really get far beyond that. ROM was a really good series. I really enjoyed where Chris Rial, who was at the time the writer and also the editor-in-chief of IDW, I enjoyed his take on that character. ROM was a character I discovered after I started hanging out with Pina Comics and, getting on Twitter, and there was a passionate fan base about it, and I discovered it, and I started enjoying the original Marvel series. Then when IDW picked it up, I enjoyed that as well. There's also the Mask franchise, another series that when IDW reimagined it in the term of a shared universe between G.I. Joe and Transformers made absolute sense, and it was a good series. And then there was also Micronauts, which didn't really resonate too much with me, but it was actually really good too. I enjoyed all 3 series, and if I was to rank them, ROM was number 1, Micronauts was actually number 2, and Mask kind of petered out at the end, so it ends up at number 3 in this. In the end, G.I. Joe and the Transformers are in talks, reportedly going to Skybound, but that news has been quiet since mid-December. Now, IDW has said they're going to finish out the year with their G.I. Joe and Transformers stories. So we're at the end of January. As I'm recording this, it's January 21st. And you got 11 months and 1 week to to get out 12 issues of G.I. Joe. To get to issue 300, which is what IDW is claiming that they are going to close out the year with. If you've ever listened to other podcasts, Talking Joe did a great interview with S.L. Gallant, and S.L. Gallant did mention that Larry Hama could be tardy or deadline beating with his scripts, and that doesn't help matters. To get to issue 300 by the end of this year, I think is going to be an editorial challenge for IDW. With that being said, it'd be really good to get that, but I think if they do achieve that, their editorial staff is going to have to make concessions, and that I think that will overall could affect the quality of the comic or consistency of the comic, as they're probably going to pull artists, while S.L. Gallant recently got the job back, they're going to have to make things happen fast, especially if Larry Hama is still going to be on the, I hate saying it, the slower side of script building. Now, the final thing, and to circle back around to the other properties that Hasbro also owns, is that whomever is seeking these licenses, I hope is also making a play for the other three properties, because one thing on a little bit more of a tangent with Rom was actually really involved with the Marvel Universe in the early 80s, meeting the likes of X-Men, Power Man, Iron Fist, and just overall just a galaxy hero. The big thing is the Knights of Galador, and they casually mention Rom without saying his name in the comics now, but maybe another company can try to bridge that so that Rom can return to the Marvel Universe in a way that would be great. Heck, maybe if Marvel itself made a play just for the Rom license, that'd be pretty fun as well. At the end, I really hope Larry gets to finish his story to issue 300. That would be a great way to close out the final year with IDW, much like how Devil's Due, the final year, Hasbro allowed them to do the World War III storyline and go out with a bang, and it was a successful bang. I wish the same send-off for IDW's G.I. Joe as well. I stopped reading the Transformers, the current series. It didn't resonate with me. I felt it was very slow in world building, and it was just going too slow for me. So I know I have friends like Johnny Ganache. He really is enjoying the Transformers series, and I told him I use that as a sleeping aid. That's about it for the news from IDW comic book world.
Now back to G.I. Joe.
Earlier today, Hasbro Pulse did their Fans First Friday event for G.I. Joe. And this time, because they opened up the Fan First Friday by, disclaimer that, everything, the worldwide pandemic, shipping, logistics changes all over the map. So what they were doing is they were revealing new product without revealing new pre-orders. And so what they ended up doing was showing digital renders throughout the approximate 20-minute broadcast they did at 11-ish a.m. Eastern Time. I'm not going to be like the Full Force podcast and recap everything, but some of my thoughts were based around the fact that they're doing new classified reveals and new O-ring reveals. There were no new 4-inch retro reveals. To start off was, and I'm just divided up into the three categories, classified figures, and then they had these retro classified card backs, and then they had the O-rings. Starting off with the classified figures, they announced Tomax and Zaymot and Stalker. To start off with Tomax and Zaymot, they are faithful 6-inch updates of the original 3 3/4 figures from 1985. And that's great. I'm sure they're going to look exquisite in hand. They didn't show any accessories, so we don't know what they're going to be doing for guns or other items, are they going to get a zip line for you to hang from your window and stretch across your bedroom? I don't believe so, but that would be a neat touch. They've mentions in their comments were about the packaging, and that would be a fun thing to do as well if they were able to reproduce that 1985 packaging. I'm excited to see those two guys. The one thing, and if I've said it before, I'll say it again, the amount of detail they're able to pack in these 6-inch figures is exquisite. They're absolutely wonderful with how they're able to scale up the 3 3/4 and bring it more to what the child's mind eye originally viewed those 3 3/4 figures for. The other classified figure they announced was Stalker. And Stalker is an amazing update of that original 1982 figure, 1983 aesthetic, with the beret and the dark green camo outfit. And now he'll also have essentially an oversized bandana or poncho around his neck, like a shortened poncho. The face and the mustache, I'm going to say that this is another home run for me with the classified figures. So happy to see Stalker brought back as a traditional trooper, and I'm going to be excited to see what he comes with for weapons and gear, because the original Stalker only came with a submachine gun. Now with the 6-inch line and with being able to actually holster more weapons, he has a sheath on one leg and then a holster on his right thigh. This is going to be another solid addition to the Joe team for classified series. It is really happy with the direction they decided to take on Stalker, because Stalker's first 3 versions in the original line, for me, are each unique but capture the character the same. While you have the original 82, 83 Stalker, who's very jungle oriented, and then you have the 89 Winter, and then you have the 92 Talking Battle Commanders, but he's in that black uniform with the beret. It's still, other than the face on that one, but they still, all 3 of them to me are great Stalker figures, and I'm happy to see what they decided to do with this classified edition. Now, the other thing they did was with the classified was retro card back releases with slight deco changes of the Baroness, of Lady J, and Destro, and they're all sharing their molds from previous classified release. But what they did was they just changed up the colors. Baroness has more shading of her black. Lady J is much more colored in her sunbow way, and also changing the makeup on her face, so the makeup tampos are going to be a little bit different. And also, as Lenny was saying in the presentation, was they are much more 80s inspired, with even blue eyeshadow. And she even has her jump wings on her hat, like the original 1985 figure. Destro, essentially the same thing, but now they've, and it was kind of funny, and it's fun joke that they added the eyebrows to the mask, and it's just a funny touch. But when looking at the digital mock-up, it's acceptable. When these things arrive on shelves, it's going to be interesting to see these in hand as well. And then the final retro card back is going to be Gung Ho in his original colors. It has a new face, he has a new cover, and he's in his original light blue with dark green camouflage splotches on his pants. That is the Gung Ho we should have gotten the first time, or something similar to that. They kept his tattoo on the chest the same as the original release, so it is that questionable Falcon Eagle thing that some people seem to have a true issue with. I know they sell reproduction stickers after you're able to wipe away or polish out the tattoo. I have not attempted to do that with my Gung Ho. it's also funny that they did this because Voliverse and Big Bad Toy Store worked together to create a Gung Ho correction kit. So like you could go to Big Bad Toy Store and pre-order this, and it's a new coat and new cover for Gung Ho, new weapons. And I think it's funny that Hasbro did this as well. I think it's kind of it's absolutely a fan response or a critical response to the original Gung Ho figure. I'm really excited for this Gung Ho because it's going to be wonderful in hand. In my collection, it would definitely supplant the other Gung Ho from display. Now, the final thing they announced during the Hasbro Pulse Fan First Friday event were the new O-Ring 2-packs. The first O-Ring 2-pack was Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow, and I just got notice in my email that they're going to be shipping early. But now the next sets, plural, announced, 2 of them, is an Army Builder pack of a Cobra Trooper and a Cobra Officer, and also Cobra Commander and Duke. Now, the Cobra Officer and Cobra Trooper are essentially faithful recreations of the 1983 issue Swivel Arm characters, same Caucasian skin and same paint apps. However, the Cobra Commander and Duke are more in their Sunbow colors. So one of the big things during this event they kept referring to was the original Sunbow series, the cartoon. It seemed they were trying to connect more with the audience that connected through G.I. Joe, not only through the toys, but through the cartoon as well. One thing, while looking through the digital renders, is Cobra Commander's head seems a little off. So I'm thinking that they're going to be retooling Cobra Commander. And Duke looks to have a slightly different smirk on his head, but I think that's only because it's a digital render. It doesn't look as much as if they're going to be retooling Duke. However, from the mock-ups on the Cobra Trooper and the Cobra Officer, it looks like that tooling is the same as the original. One thing mentioned was on the Troop Builder pack, they made sure there was no named character in that pack because they knew that to sell Troop Builders, having the named character would be a deterrent. So they wanted to make sure that they packed it as such. And that is absolutely a smart thing on their part. That means they're actually listening to the market rather than doing what they've done in the past. So this is a team that's learning from the mistakes of the past. Now, doing the Duke and Cobra Commander together is another good choice because you have 2 named characters, and it also means that they understand that they're not going to be making as much of these guys as they are the Troop Builders. One thing I'm hoping is the buying limits on these is going to be raised from what the original limit was for the Storm Shadow Snake Eyes 2-pack. For the Storm Shadow Snake Eyes 2-pack, you're allowed to buy 2. And for me, that would be perfect for myself, but I purchased a set for my friend in Norway, so I'm only going to end up with 1. And I really want to try to leave 1 in the box and then open 1 because I really want to play with these. I really want to see how they interact with their accessories. But I would also like to make sure for Cobra Commander and Duke, I would like to be able to buy 3 so I could keep 2 for myself and send 1 to my friend. And the Troop Builders, I would love to be able to order a half a dozen of each. Because if my experience with Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow is positive enough, one of these things that I'm going to do with these new figures is I'm going to have my original set, but I'm going to move them off to the side and keep them as, the collection, and then use these new ones as display toys and play with them and just be able to do that without having the same high cost of entry of, let's say, building out 24 Cobra Troopers. If I could get 6 or a dozen, of these packs. I would rather just have, 6 is probably my limit. I could supplant 6 originals and maybe release them to another collector that wants more originals. For me, I want to always have like an original or 2, but having a newer official release that I can enjoy a little, for the lack of a better term, harder, instead of having to really worry about being gentle all the time, for me would be is a great idea. Same thing goes for Duke, especially. Wouldn't it be nice to have a Duke that doesn't have a broken crotch? And Cobra Commander is just Cobra Commander. I love him. And one thing would be really cool with this Cobra Commander figure is if they made another rubberized hooded Cobra Commander head, because hooded Cobra Commander is my Cobra Commander, and he's my Cobra Commander from my youth. He's my Cobra Commander from the comic book, because when you first meet him, he's wearing that hood. And that would be a really nice touch. However, Hasbro, for whatever reason, has decided that the hooded Cobra Commander, the hooded visage, is much more evil than the mirrored face. And I could probably just, my 2 cents on that whole thing, if you're so concerned about creating a bad guy for a toy line, then why are you creating a bad guy in the toy line in the first place? You do have like the World Heroes packs at, Walmart, where all you do is you get all the army heroes and all the soldiers and stuff, but you don't find terrorists for them to fight. You don't have another army for them to fight. You don't have opposition. And that was one thing that made a Real American Hero line unique at the time, was they had the bad guys. They had a storyline built in. And they made the bad guys terrorists, so they weren't singling out a country like, communist Russia or communist China, communist Cuba. But you get the picture, communists. So they were very careful to avoid that, especially after, in 1982, it was only 8 years after Vietnam. So that was very forward thinking on them. But let's go back to the hood thing. In America, if you're listening from overseas, the hood is greatly associated with the Ku Klux Klan, essentially a white supremacist group dating back to the end of the Civil War. And they're wearing white sheets. They're clad in white, and Cobra Commander's clad in blue. I know you're not, like I said, you need to have somebody. The one thing is, G.I. Joe has somebody to fight that's kind of non-denominational. They're just evil terrorists. Terrorist is a nice generic bad guy term. If you're going to create a bad guy, why not just make sure that they're obviously bad? And, watching other reviews and other things, like Hooded Cobra Commander made a great point about Gristle. One of the headmans is like, you could buy an action figure of a drug dealer, a mass polluter, cesspool. I mean, you had the scum of the scum on the Cobra side. Destro, arms dealer. That's the one thing. You want, especially if you're creating bad guys for your heroes to fight, you want them to be bad. And if you're afraid of making somebody so evil that people would want to emulate them, then why are you even making bad guys in the first place? And that's really just my 2 cents on the whole hooded Cobra Commander, helmeted Cobra Commander thing. But at the end of the day, I am really happy that they're redoing the O-ring aesthetic. I know there's a lot of opinion on who they want to be next for O-ring figures. And I know there's a lot of things like, I would love to have the named characters that never got figures. My favorites would come out of the comic book line, like Bongo the Balloon Bear, Soft Master, Hard Master, Blind Master. Okay, let's get off the ninjas for a second. I would love a proper Big Lob. I like my 2010 Big Lob, but the head sculpt really just needs to be updated. But at the end of the day, let's think about another problem that Hasbro had with the O-ring molds. They lost a bunch. So why not retool a V2 Snake Eyes? Everybody loves these figures, and they're commanding huge money. Let's think about figures that they lost the original tooling for, and right now with these things they could retool them. And anybody should think about it is like they would sell a ton of version 2 Snake Eyes. Be like, oh my gosh, they lost that tooling in the late 90s when they wanted to retool for the 3-packs. And that's the reason why we keep getting version 1 Snake Eyes. So in short summary, they really introduced some cool new 6-inch and 3 3/4-inch figures. I am really excited for the O-rings, and the classified line still excites me with the level of detail they're bringing to these classic designs. And again, I'm looking forward to seeing what else they're going to do with that scale as well.
Now back to G.I. Joe.
In my last podcast, I mentioned I was able to make one hammer out of 3 hammers that I had already in my possession from various lots I had bought. This week, because I alternate Cobra versus G.I. Joe while looking at vehicles, we're going to look at the hammer, because last week it was the Cobra Night Landing. The hammer is a throwback to the early days of G.I. Joe, where Hasbro took inspiration from a real military vehicle and put it into the G.I. Joe line. The hammer is based on the AM General Humvee, sometimes known as Hummer, which was a General Motors brand and just recently relaunched as a EV. But the AM General Humvee is short for HMMWV, which stands for High Mobility Multi-Purpose Wheeled Vehicle. And overall, the Humvee got really popular from 1991's Desert Storm. The Humvee was the replacement for the original Jeep, and I discussed that a little bit in my Vamp episode. So the Humvee, made the transition in the early 90s, and while it really took center stage in 1991's Desert Storm, in 1990 we got the G.I. Joe hammer. And the hammer is a very popular vehicle because it is that throwback to the early days of G.I. Joe. So a lot of collectors want it, and that drives the price. Another thing that drives the price of a hammer is the fragility of it, especially in the United States. I have heard that the plastic in the overseas market, they used a more robust chemical composition for the plastic so it doesn't degrade as fast, because the hammer has some of the most delicate plastic that I've ever had to work with. Because of that, it was more advantageous for me, because I don't really want to be repairing my display vehicles. I would rather have great parts. However, again, I think this is the third time I mentioned him this episode, Hooded Cobra Commander. He had to repair his antenna, which is the only thing I have left to do to my hammer. I have not drilled out the peg and the antenna to put a dowel in there and to glue it together to make sure that it's safe. That's the only thing I have left to do to my hammer. Maybe this is a little premature, but there it is. If you're not familiar with the Humvee is actually a rather large military multi-purpose vehicle, much like the Jeep or the MA-80 or their other civilian-based transports. They did a lot with Chevrolet in the 1980s with like diesel Blazers and diesel Silverados. So when you get a hammer in hand, it is noticeably larger than a vamp. And where a vamp, your driver and passenger are sitting shoulder to shoulder, you could sit, if there was a center seat, you could sit 3 across a hammer and have plenty of shoulder room. The other thing is with the hammer is you have a back seat as well for an additional 2 figures. And that works. It is, while it does come across large, it might be, let's just say, and it's scaled well, you might think it's a little too large, and that could be a fair criticism of the mold. However, because you're dealing with toys, it does make it easier for you to get your figures in and out. Speaking of getting your figures in and out, the hammer has that early 90s things of the clips. So instead of having the seatbelts like they did in 1988 and 1989, where you had the seatbelt that would pop in and out and you just had to ratchet it in and out, these use the clips. Personally, they stink. I am not a huge fan of the clips. I would rather have the seatbelts in a heartbeat, especially with the fact that, hey, it's a car. Cars have seatbelts. Or Jeeps have seatbelts. That might be my first detractor of the hammer. The next thing about the hammer, you have the 2 side guns that exist on the running boards. The side guns have foot pegs off of a swivel mount, and you have in the center of the roof, much like a real Humvee, you have essentially a 50 caliber machine gun that's mounted, so your character would be standing up shooting that. And the character standing up on that, this is where the first time you get it like anything of a space issue, is he would be kind of standing one leg on the passenger. So it's not central, it's offset over to the passenger side. On the back, you have almost essentially a hatchback sloped roof, but it's kind of has almost like a raised trunk lid, and it's split in half, so it slides apart. And on each one of those, there are a missile rack each housing 3 missiles, so 6 missiles total on the back. And they swivel around 360 degrees, and they pivot, for the most part, 90 degrees up and down. And that means they have a negative elevation of probably negative 45 degrees and a positive elevation of 45 degrees. Another thing about this fragile, those clips that hold that, they're pegged in to the trunk area, and I wouldn't call it a trunk lid because it slides apart, parts in the middle. Those clips break often. Now another thing is sliding them back and forth. It's designed as a friction fit, which no problem there, but it's a really tight friction fit. When during the assembling and reassembling of my hammers, I found it easier just to gently, if I could get one slid out a little bit, I was able to pop the friction fit at the rear of the cover and pop it off and take it off rather than keep sliding it in and out. I felt more confident doing that than if I kept sliding in and out. I was afraid my hand was going to slip and break something. Underneath those sliding doors is a compartment for putting, weapons and gear, much like the tripod. And so you take out this tripod, has a swing out leg, and then you can take the machine gun off the mount, off the top of the hammer, and put it on the tripod as a heavy machine gun for the infantry. The 50 cal also features essentially a belt that you can slide back and forth to mimic a belt fed 50 cal. There's also an ammo box that stores on like a little shelf that's molded to the gun, or you could take that off and put it in a compartment inside the interior of the hammer as well. At the very back of the hammer, there's a gas can, sometimes known as a jerry can. Unfortunately, like the vamp was nice because it had the nice carry handles. This one doesn't, so it's kind of awkward, and it's really big compared to those jerry cans from the vamp, and with no carry handle, it's just, for lack of a better term, I could just say it's a nice try. Get a trophy for trying. And then as I move to the left side, the driver's side, you have the antenna. It's an old school whip antenna that you peg down into the little mount, and then it bends forward and latches into the roof, creating an arc. Most of these antennas have broken, and most of them have broken into multiple pieces. This is made of the same fragile plastic as everything else that's gray, other than the roof. And this is going to be the biggest money item on a hammer. And that's why finding one of these complete and unbroken is such a expense. You know, you have wonderful wheels, and if you were to look at the hammer's profile compared to a Humvee's profile, if you're looking at it from like the model kit aesthetic or perspective, you'll notice that the hammer rides a little lower to the ground, and the wheels you would think are a little wider than what the Hummer would have had. But from the toy side, the 10-year-old me that would be playing with this would think this is cool. It's kind of like a hot rod. You know, it has that raised in the rear stance, getting ready to race into battle. You know, it's very aggressive looking. Moving to the front, you have a detachable bump. Well, I would say a detachable bumper, but again, gray plastic, it's fragile. If you have any issue with the hood, trying to get this off is an absolute nightmare, because you are going to crack the plastic while trying to just create enough room for the hood to be able to pry it up and open. And when I talk about some of these things, it's kind of what I went through when I was picking out a shell to build out of my 3 hammers. It's which one had this, which one had that, and when I found things, it was like, okay, move from that to that. And it honestly came down for this shell that I'm holding to describe to you guys, it was this bumper. The bumper was the number one thing I had to have unbroken before I could build the rest of the shell. And so the bumper provides the tab which completes the hinge for the hood. Now the hood opens up to reveal the engine. And they're calling it via the sticker the Ram Servo Assisted Superchargers, which would be to a diesel. Diesel engines can be supercharged. And it's a semi-detailed engine bay. You have the cover, which is in gray, which goes on the engine, which is the same off tan, very light tan of the hammer, with 2 little fans hanging out, which they're there for a purpose, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what they do. The one thing that the hammer doesn't have, like the earlier G.I. Joe toys, is if you were to look at the bottom of the hammer, it's not finished like you would have in the Vamp. So the belly is hollow. You know, you see the molds for where they created the seats and everything. So where the Vamp is like a 2-piece where you have the top and the bottom that completes the shell, this just has the one injection mold formed body. So the rear suspension clips in. You know, it's not movable, so I guess you can't really call it a suspension. And that's about it. There's not much detail underneath. So if you're playing and then you have something that explodes underneath it and flips it up to its roof, breaking the antenna, you're not really going to get like, oh, it doesn't look flipped over a model car. The one thing I skipped while going around was, unlike the actual Humvee, the hammer doesn't have doors, which is good because it makes getting your action figures in and out easier. And even the steering wheel can swivel out of the way a little bit for the driver. And that's very handy because if you have the clips in place, they're going to break because you're going to stress the plastic. That's helpful. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about on the hammer is the center console, which is mildly detailed with 2 shifter levers, probably one for gear select and one for 4-wheel drive. And, you know, you got a couple buttons, it looks like. But overall, it's not a intricately detailed dash. Again, judging it to the Vamp and the Stinger, it's not as detailed as that. Now, the hammer does have a little brother. In the early 2000s, they released the Brawler, which is essentially a redecoed, remolded, recolored, and slightly different armament hammer. It features a woodland camouflage instead of being in a gray on light tan arrangement. And I built mine from a kit that I bought for a song. And the hammer didn't come with a driver, but the Brawler came with the New Sculpt era heavy duty. And the other thing that distinguishes the Brawler from the hammer is instead of having a belt-fed machine gun coming through the roof, it has a Gatling cannon firing 6 missiles on top that swivels around, and also a shorter and slightly different shaped whip antenna. If you can't find a hammer with an unbroken antenna, a Brawler antenna will fit. And I will say this, because finding a unbroken hammer is such a pain or expensive proposition, hindsight, or let's just say my point of view, is it wouldn't be a bad idea to just pick up a Brawler, take off the cannon off the top, and put the machine gun from a hammer on top of the Brawler. And then on top of that, to give the Brawler a little more better aesthetic. Because one of the things that the Brawler does is it starts using that light blue plastic for the machine guns, the cannon, and the missiles in the rear. Is take those machine guns off the sides, and then take the missiles out the back, and then pop the missiles from the hammer on. Just because you have those peg holes in the rear trunk area, and you just change a couple things around, the Brawler becomes a nice, acceptable substitute for the hammer. It's just something to think about, as the Brawler is still much easier to find. It won't be as desirable because it didn't come out in that magic time frame. It's a great substitute, and it's a hidden gem from the New Sculpt era. Now, who mans a hammer? Honestly, as I'm thinking about the G.I. Joe team, the G.I. Joe team to me is mostly Army. It's mostly infantry. And the other thing is, too, especially with the military, is the Humvee is such a ubiquitous vehicle regardless of branch. It has its applications everywhere. It'd be more appropriate to say which figures don't fit inside a hammer. We're talking figures like Topside, Deep Six, Cutter, anybody that is clearly aquatic or piloting an airframe in nature. You can have Salvo drive this. You could have Duke. You could have just about every G.I. Joe be a part of this and man this. Clutch would be a good fit, especially 1984 with the hammer. It is the sky's the limit, really, with G.I. Joe and who can go in the hammer. Colonel Courage, putting the guys on the big guns on the side, heavy duty, just like what came on the G.I. Joe versus Cobra Brawler, or Rock and Roll, Roadblock. The neat thing about the hammer and the Brawler is they fit in so well regardless of what era of G.I. Joe you play with. It is just that right shade of color that makes it a little bit off. It's off just enough so that it fits in everywhere. Because the fact that you could throw any character you want in it makes it just about useful in every collection. It's such a must-have. And that's what drives its demand. The fragility of the hammer drives its price as well, which makes finding a good one so much more important and so much more valuable. The fragility of the basic toy is really, for me, the only true con of the vehicle. And it's the only true con because the side guns, which for the most part do look gaudy, but they still fit in that G.I. Joe aesthetic. Like, you just got to have that little extra touch that makes it a little bit above and beyond, like having missile racks located right in front of your characters on the bumper. Is they're easily removable. Now, you got to be careful again, because that gray plastic, if you're pushing it up, take something like a small screw or something blunt and push that out, pushing the pin from the bottom, so you're not breaking that plastic. And it looks awesome. It just looks like a Humvee with some missiles on the back. And because of that, it is, to me, it's one of the must-haves. The hammer, the 1990 G.I. Joe hammer, on a scale of 1 to 5 machine guns, taking into account the fragility and using the Pinacomic scale, where quarter scale is approachable, is applicable, it is a 4 3/4 machine guns out of 5. Now, the 2002 Brawler from the G.I. Joe and Cobra line, because of the blue plastic, because of the oversized Gatling launcher located on the roof, and because I'm suggesting that you need parts to fix it, I'm going to have to give that a 4 1/4 machine guns out of 5. To me, they're both must-owns, and I'm glad I have both in my collection. And that concludes this episode of the Chaplain's Assistant's Motor Pod, the strange, but not estranged, nerdy little brother of the PintOComics.com broadcasting family. You can find us on Anchor.fm, our host, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and other fine podcatching platforms. While you're there, don't forget to subscribe, like, rate, or leave a, hopefully, 5-star review. Doing this really makes a difference and only helps to improve and grow this podcast. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at ChaplainJoePod. On Facebook, just search for the Chaplain's Assistant's Motor Pod in the search bar. Or you can just send an email to chaplainjoepod@gmail.com. And before I go, just one more missile for the masses. Be decent to each other. See ya.